My name is Ruby Jennings. This is Matt Santa Cruz, Kim Rodriguez, and Stephen Chung. So I'm just going to quickly take you through our process. Thank you. So as you know, there are 4 potential HSR projects: Northwest, California, Midwest, and Northeast. We were tasked with selecting one project for initiation and completion. So, we gathered data on the 4 potential projects, and then we conducted some research on best practices in Asia and Europe. And then we assessed some of the benefits and risks for each proposed project with our evaluation framework. And then we decided to recommend a project for FRC to initiate as soon as possible. And finally, we designed a broad implementation strategy. So our recommendation is to use high-speed rail expansion in the Northeast Corridor because this would represent a historic investment in the future of our nation. So these are the 3 broad justifications that we based our current recommendation on. So first of all, there's a high likelihood of success and self-sufficiency by 2022 by going with the Northeast. Also, we'll be able to leverage the high economic potential of the Northeast Corridor. And then finally, we're going to be able to build on and improve robust and existing rail infrastructure. So now that I've given you our broad overall recommendation, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to explain our recommendation further.
Great, and good afternoon. Thank you. So as Ruby mentioned, these 3 sort of broad justifications are really rooted in the evaluation framework that we presented to you all a few months ago. We thought that was pretty well received, and we figured that we would sort of move on that basis and sort of try to, where possible, connect the plan that we're about to run through with you guys to the sort of evaluation criteria that we presented a few months ago. So the first one that we're going to go through, the 3 of these in just a little bit of detail. As far as the likelihood of success goes, we feel that the Northeast Corridor really has the potential to garner a high degree of political support at both the state and local levels, both of which are important to us. As we try and make sure that this is a project that sort of has a lifespan that exceeds 2022, certainly, I think ongoing political support is a really important piece of that. We think that exists in the Northeast to a large extent. In addition, we think that there's a really robust and sort of vibrant culture of rail commuting and rail travel that exists currently in the region that we think is going to drive demand for high-speed rail, again, not just in the next 5 years or 10 years, but in 20 years down the road at least. We have a real strong feeling that the growth that I think is foreseeable in the education, technology, and healthcare industries in the Northeast will sustain additional demand for the services into the future. It's our indication of our research that this is a real sort of growing part of the country with respect to this kind of knowledge economy idea, and we think that high-speed rail really plays into that in a nice way. And finally, our research about what really works in Europe and in Asia in designing and implementing a high-speed rail system indicates that the geographical distances involved with the major hubs in the Northeast Corridor are really conducive to success in that particular way. We think there's a sort of sweet spot geographically that the Northeast really kind of hits. So again, talking about the economic impact, which was a big part of our evaluation criteria as well, there's sort of a 2-stage idea here. One is that it does connect the urban centers that are really the hubs of the nation's economic, political, and cultural activity. These come to mind from New York, Boston, et cetera. And in addition, the fact that it does route right through the sort of most densely populated region of the U.S. will reduce congestion on major highways, which sort of has a really concerted double bottom line effect as well. Not only does it reduce the carbon impact, carbon emissions from trucks on the road, it also reduces shipping costs and drives economic activity in the region in a real way. And finally, with respect to the social benefit part as well, but also to the economic benefit, we think that there's a real value to connecting non-thriving cities and regions with the sort of world leaders that everybody thinks about initially. These sort of like lesser thought of cities like Newark and Hartford, we think stand to derive some real substantial spillover benefits from the creation of high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor, which has a real benefit to the people living in those cities. And then just lastly, as other folks have mentioned, the existing rail infrastructure, I think, is a big part of why we think this is a feasible idea. The Acela tracks, that sort of quasi high-speed rail system that exists currently, are easily upgraded to high-speed rail travel at 220 miles per hour. We think that evidence from Europe points to some really clear advantages to connecting high-speed rail with the existing urban multimodal transportation systems that exist in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Currently, these are things like commuter rail, things like subways and buses and that kind of thing. And there's a real clear connection that we think has the potential to exist. And finally, we've already mentioned this before, but just to bring it back, the likelihood of the political and community opposition to land acquisition because of the fact that these rails, to a large extent, kind of already exist, is much reduced. And that sort of helps us deal with one of the big risks that we saw, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So moving on, Stephen's going to take it from here.
All right, I'll go over some of the risks of the project. So we did an analysis of the costs of this project, and as you can see, the Northeast does have the highest costs, both in terms of per mile, per rider, and total costs. We're not going to gloss over that, but we're going to. I think it is offset by the high profitability and the proven demand in this in the Northeast corridor, and the economic multiplier effects caused by that. We also feel that there's strong financial support from multiple states. We think that in California in particular, it looks similar, but the costs are limited to one state, whereas in the Northeast corridor, multiple states get to pool the costs and share the financial support, and we believe that this helps the sustainability argument of the Northeast corridor. Another risk is that this the economic impact is less than the economic growth is less than the Northwest and the Midwest because of it's so highly developed in this economy. But we believe that there is a high potential benefit for smaller distressed cities like Newark, Hartford, and Connecticut, which would benefit from this rail corridor greatly. Finally, one major risk is the national security risk, the increased national security risks. Because this is a larger target, we think that this would become a larger security risk. But we believe that this is mitigated due to the fact that police law enforcement in this area has a great experience working in this field, and they're particularly experienced dealing with these risks. And a consortium of local, state, and federal law enforcement authorities can deal with it. Finally, I want to go over an analysis of alternative proposals. We believe that the Midwest and the Northwest proposals, there would be high marginal economic impact for those proposals, and they are low cost. But we believe that it's not sustainable in the long run. We see that the population density in those areas lead to low ridership projections, and that in the long term, this would require ongoing subsidies, but by most likely state governments. And that would in turn kind of lower public support for the project. In California, we do see that it is similar in some respects to the Northeast corridor, but the big con is that it doesn't connect multiple states. It only connects within one state, and as I said before, the sustainability argument just isn't there. Also, in California, there are fewer congestion problems to be solved, which I think the European experience shows that rail solving congestion problems is a big plus.
So what would the rollout plan look like? So we've created three broad phases, and I'll briefly go over it. The first, by 2012, within 3 years, break ground, so to speak. We want to see by 2011 a finalized design and a buy-in of political support from the multiple states involved. We also want to see beginning of construction of new stations or upgrading of stations in the critical links between New York, Boston, and DC to Philly by 2012, as well as any upgrading of tracks as well. And we also want to start building a PR campaign to reach the public, so it's not a surprise to the public when it comes to implementation of the rest of the project. Phase 2 by 2016, critical links are near, like around 3/4 complete or already completed, easing in ridership, working out any kinks involved, and then the rolling stock or train procurement has been accomplished for the critical links. By 2022, the project will be completed with critical links running successfully, station upgrades and rolling stock and new stations done in the critical links, and as well as in the final stage of Philly to New York. And the promotion of ridership is taking off and running a successful project. So in summary, we think that the Northeast has a high reward investment. There's high congestion, and it'll give the most potential benefit for long-term success. has urban multimodal transportations that can link to downtowns and big cities, has the cultural and political and economic strengths, and we think that this can be a model for the future on taking rail in the U.S. back on the world map.
Thank you. So do you have any, take any questions you have?
Help me sell your proposal to our private investor. What is their means of return for your decision to go with the most expensive? Now I know you have high ridership. Were you able to factor in any what you perceive as required rate per ride in order to give me the break even that my investors might be looking for? Can you tell me about how they choose to join that consortium?
I think that's a really good point. We weren't able to find projected ridership costs right away, but I think that you can sell private investors by looking at the other cities that we can grow off of. You know, we have a lot of really strong cities in the Northeast, but still some that really need to grow, like Baltimore and Hartford, which Matt touched upon. So I think we can use that as one of our justifications, and I think you can use that to help sell to private investors.
Can also bring in new technology, those that have existed in Europe, and help bring it into the United States, which will also help investors, draw investors into that technology.
Things that I'm, a little bit concerned about with regard to the Northeast Corridor is, from a competition perspective, there's a fairly established rail system already, correct? And a big part of the shift or the increased competition from this rail system, I think, is going to garner a good deal of pushback, in particular from the unions. So I'm curious if you took that into account at all, or what you think we can do to start to head some of that off. I can kind of foresee us in, some pretty tricky conversations. As you know, most of the personnel, on Amtrak are unionized. So I want to make sure we've thought through that as part of this election.
Sure.
Let alone already government subsidized.
So was that a question, or?
That was a question. Help me understand how we address that concern.
Sure. So I would reference certainly our evaluation criteria that you all sort of adopted a few months ago, which I think stated very clearly that targeting of local contractors, of union labor, and working with those constituencies that are on the ground today is a really strong part of what we're thinking about, is a really significant part of what we're thinking about when we're selecting a project. Certainly the community support piece, which is a really kind of broad catch-all term, but does involve these constituencies that include labor, include environmental groups, and include sort of land rights groups. But the labor is a big part of that. And so I think to the extent that we can involve them in discussions from the very beginning stages of this project, and understand that they have a role in the process, that they're at the table, and that their input is valued and is substantively reflected in our proposal. I think that's what we would really shoot for.
So looking at the Northeast Corridor, it is, you mentioned this as a potential benefit, is that there's a lot of activity going on in that area, but then of course there's the potential for disruption if you're projects and upgrading the track and so on. How would you mitigate some of the potential economic effects? Because the last thing I think that we would want is to disrupt rail travel in the Northeast Corridor in any significant manner. That being a bastion already for support, we don't want to take away a major bastion of support for high-speed rail.
Do you want to do this? As far as mitigating any of the economic burdens, one thing we looked at was tourism as well. Now we noticed that there will be less overnight stays, but one of the big things is that it'll increase business travel between some of the biggest economic centers, which will actually be economic benefit. We also noticed that the services industry would benefit from the increase of train, despite the industrial having already been industrialized in that corridor.
So more about how do you mitigate the potential economic disruption of the investment project itself, the construction and so on? Have you given any thought to that?
Sure. So I think it's a big question. I think that to the extent that you can work closely with, I think the thing that's coming to mind is like the Chris Christie thing, right? In in New Jersey when they decided to do this
Several years
construction.
in the future.
Huh?
Several
Right.
years-
I guess what I was going to say is that there's a real need to work. There's a real need to work with and involve like local and regional planning and coordination agencies in the government and non-government spaces when you're talking about a project of this magnitude, right? And that you can't come in as the Federal Rail Commission and say we're breaking ground, deal with it. There needs to be what we presented here as far as an implementation strategy is really just the beginning of the conversation. There needs to be a really well thought out and sustained conversation about like who the people are that we need to get involved, and then what their priorities are, and to really like kind of take advantage of their really detailed knowledge of Boston, of New York, Philadelphia, et cetera, and to kind of try and coordinate that across the board as we move forward with each stage of this project. But yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue.
And I think getting to like the root of your question, I think there are ways to upgrade rail travel, segmentally, doing it at night or things like that. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.